Hey! So, as some of you may know, this summer I've had an internship at the New York Botanical Gardens Herbarium, and when I've been talking with my friends and family, I've realized that a lot of people don't know what an herbarium is, which makes perfect sense. A couple years ago, before I started going to the botanical gardens a lot and getting really interested in ecology and plant science, I had no idea what an herbarium is. So I recently gave a presentation at work about what I was doing this summer during my internship, and I thought that I might summarize my presentation here to share with my friends and family. So first of all, what is an herbarium? An herbarium is a collection of pressed plant specimens systematically arranged. It's basically like a library of pressed plants. But why would we need a big library of pressed plants? What's the big deal? Well, herbaria are important for a huge variety of research efforts around the world. So picture a 6-story building, and each floor of the building has an entire floor filled with cabinets. These cabinets are on tracks where they can compress close together so that there's more room, or they can open up so you can walk down the hallways and find plant specimens. And in New York, there are over 7 million plant specimens in these cabinets. So a huge, vast array of the world's biodiversity is preserved there. And why would you need that? Well, you could be a researcher looking into the genetics of a particular plant family. You might need a tissue sample or a seed sample to go and collect. After you collected it, you could use that tissue sample to sequence the DNA and find out more about it. It can also be used for atmospheric science studies. So atmospheric science, that's the science of what's out there in the atmosphere around the Earth. And let's say you had a plant specimen from a century ago and you compared it to a plant specimen of today. You could use that to measure the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere compared to 100 years ago. And that has so many uses in regards to studying climate change. You could also use it if you were a taxonomist or a botanist, someone who studies plants, someone who studies species and where they go in the tree of life. It helps botanists more accurately identify specimens that they've collected from the field. Let's say they've collected this certain type of grass and they're pretty sure it's a species, but they're not sure. They can compare it against established species at the herbarium. And they can also look at the way different plants look in the herbarium in order to find some brand new species and see where it fits in the tree of life. And it's also hugely important for conservation. So conservation efforts can be undertaken in an herbarium. For example, herbarium sheets, they don't just have the plant with no label or just the plant with the plant name. They have the plant, they have when it was collected, they have where it was collected, and they have the collector name. So let's say you want to make a map of an endangered plant species over time. You can use herbarium specimens to map out where that species has been found. Granted, these maps won't be complete because obviously we don't have records of every plant that ever existed, but it's a great starting point, and it's a great way to track things like climate change because let's say this plant used to be found very far south and now it's not anymore. That could be evidence of the plant creeping north. You can also detect what time of year plants flower because if a flower was blooming in May, just in full bloom, open, that might mean there was a certain temperature in May that caused that blooming. So let's say you had a plant that was blooming in May in 1941, and then you have a plant collected in 2001 that was blooming in March. That's way earlier in the year. This could provide support to studies about climate change and how it's impacting the way plants grow today. So in an atmosphere where we're in the 6th mass extinction, we're losing more and more species every year, sometimes before they're even discovered, not to mention climate change, invasive species, and deforestation, all of these studies are super important. So these institutions are great, right? Unfortunately, a lot of smaller herbaria around the country have closed recently. Since 1997, almost 100 North American herbaria have closed. Basically, there's very little funding for most things in the scientific community these days. The National Science Foundation's funding shrinks every year, and it's really unfortunate. And sometimes people view natural history collections and herbaria as old-fashioned. Why would we need that? And of course, based on everything I said previously, you know why we would need it. And So it's unfortunate. Tons of small universities and smaller barrier closing their doors. However, this may sound doom and gloom, but there are some benefits to smaller barrier closing because the specimens don't just get thrown onto a bonfire. Usually they get sent to a larger institution that has the resources to house these specimens. And that can be great. Sending your specimens to a larger institution could mean that more scientists can have eyes on them. A lot of these institutions have more resources, so they might be able to digitize the specimens and share them with the world. And the plants might be stored a little bit better if this institution has enough funding to properly take care of them. Fortunately, I work at one of the larger herbariums, the largest herbarium in the Western Hemisphere, actually. That's the New York Botanical Gardens Herbarium. And they are one of these organizations that takes in collections from smaller institutions. And this is, I was an intern in what's known as the Herbarium Expansion. So the head of the herbarium and a couple scientists at New York applied to the National Science Foundation for a grant to absorb as many specimens as they could, improve their curation, and post them online so that researchers around the country and just interested citizens like you and me could see the specimens that were there. So that's where I come in. I'm one of these interns, and there are about a dozen interns that will be hired to work on the expansion. And what they do is that they help improve curation, better organize things, make sure that everything is up to date in the herbarium. For example, if you want the palm families to be organized according to the latest scientific information about how they're all related, and in turn, someone's shuffling around all of those boxes. It's a very analog process. But what I mostly spend my time doing is taking pictures. So I take the specimens out of their boxes, I arrange them on an image sheet, and I take pictures of them. Eventually those images are processed and put online. You can spend hours exploring the pictures of specimens online if you want to. I think they're really beautiful, and I also spend a lot of time transcribing the information on the outside of labels and putting them into the database. And so on the outside of a label, I do a lot of algae specimen collections. They'll have the explorer name, the collector's name, the date, and the location of collection, as well as the species name. And I really get insight into a lot of stories that way. A lot of our specimens are hundreds of years old. My favorite specimen, I found one that had, the collector was William Randolph Taylor, and he collected algae on a US military expedition to set off nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands it was a nuclear testing mission. And they brought a botanist along to this remote place in Oceania because these plants had never been described scientifically before. But there's really a lot of interesting stories there. When you're seeing these collections, you're kind of seeing a person's life over time. You're seeing where they went and what they found there, and that's a really interesting insight into these people who spent their entire lives traveling the world collecting plants. So I've learned a lot during my internship. I'm hopefully going to be able to show my slideshow at the bottom of this, or at least link to it, and I hope this has been informative on how I've spent my summer for my friends and family.